peace in the world. Doesn't mean anything until you tell me how you go from here to there. And I've only heard one proposal, that you move to the international consensus, which essentially everybody accepts outside the United States and Israel. And once that's established, my guess is that the people themselves will see that it doesn't make any sense. Anyone who's traveled in that region or lived there knows that there's simply no sensible way to draw a line through Cisjordan that makes any sense at all. So I assume that what would happen is that the cycle of violence would reduce, relations would begin in normal ways to be established, commercial, cultural, others. In fact, it already is happening, across the border with Jordan. And when that continues, at some point, there'll be a recognition that should move towards something like maybe federalism. And from federalism, you can move on to something closer if the two sides see that there's a better way to live. And in the longer term, my feeling is the people in that whole region, given, if they're not blocked by imperial power, will move towards something like kind of an Ottoman system. Now, nobody wants the Ottoman Empire back, it's brutality, corruption, and everything else. But they had the right idea about something. They left people alone, partly because they were too corrupt to do anything about it. But they left people alone, so, you go to Beirut or Jerusalem, wherever it is, the Armenians run their affairs, and the Greeks run their affairs, and the Jews run their affairs. There weren't many of them. And they sort of interact. It was kind of a pretty friendly. You could travel from Cairo to Baghdad to Constantinople without ever crossing a border. And there were plenty of connections. And for that region, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot of sense for almost every region, but that's another story. And I think maybe it could move on to that. I mean, if there's some other plan, I'd like to hear it. But the only other thing I hear is slogans.
Over here.
Mr. Chomsky, in 2007 at Camp David, in 2000 at Camp David, under Clinton's direction, Ehud Barak offered 97% of the West Bank and 100% of the Gaza Strip, and Arafat turned his head and walked away from the negotiations. What ensued was the Second Intifada and years of Hamas and Palestinian terrorism targeted against Israel. How can you fallaciously claim that it was Barak that walked away from the negotiations when it was in fact Yasser Arafat who turned around?
You're talking about the Camp David agreements in 2000?
Yes.
Yeah. We really don't have to discuss that because Clinton himself recognized that they made no sense. In fact, a couple of months, you can look it up if you want, but what I said is easily documented. It's all in print. The Camp David negotiations were in the summer. The standard tale here is what you said. But a couple of months later, Clinton recognized that no Palestinian, no Arab is ever going to accept the terms that he and Barak tried to impose. He recognized they made no sense. He presented his parameters in December, and just as I said, he gave a speech in which he said both sides have accepted them, they have reservations, they'll meet to work out their reservations, then followed what I described. So there's no need to discuss it. There really isn't. I mean, there is an official story, it's true, but like a lot of official stories, it falls apart very quickly as soon as you look at the facts.
Over here.
Maybe I don't know enough about the relationship between the United States and Israel, but why, in your opinion, why do you think the U.S. has been allowing Israel to allow these war crimes and to become, just to be almost voiceless about what's going on, even though they're very much aware that terrible things are happening and there's so much injustice currently.
I'm sorry.
Why do you think that why do you think the U.S. is on the side of Israel and allows them to?
So why does the U.S. support these criminal actions in the West Bank and Gaza and so on? Well, I mean, part of the reason is pretty simple. Israeli Jews are people, Palestinians are unpeople, and you treat people and unpeople quite differently. But then there are serious reasons too. Israel offers a lot to the United States. Palestine offers them nothing. Palestinians have no force, they have no wealth, they don't have powerful support, so they don't have any human rights. I mean, it's an elementary principle of statecraft. Israel, on the other hand, is a rich, advanced, technologically advanced, highly militarized society. It provides, it has very close strategic and intelligence relations with the U.S. In fact, if you look back at the history, U.S.-Israeli relations were established in their current form in 1967, and something happened in 1967. There was, we know that there was an Israeli-Arab war, but there was more than that. At that time, there was a war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And it was an actual war. It was fought in Yemen, mostly proxy war, but it was real. And what lay behind it was a serious conflict between secular nationalism based in Egypt and extremist religious fundamentalism based in Saudi Arabia. And the US and the UK have pretty consistently supported extremist fundamentalism, and still do, in fact, and opposed secular nationalism. And there's good reasons for that. Secular nationalism threatens, whether we'll do it or not, to take over the resources of the region and use them for the benefit of its people. A religious extremist fundamentalism, they'll work for whoever will let them play their games and get wealthy. There's incidentally very good historical work on this for both Britain and the United States, if you want the documentation. But it's pretty consistent, and it continues today. Well, this conflict was going on, and Israel succeeded in destroying the center of Arab secular nationalism, which was in Egypt. And that was a great gift to the United States and to Saudi Arabia, its main ally. And they were impressed. Actually, it's a long history, but that made a change. And that's when the relations were established in their current form. And then it continued. So in 1970, for example, Jordan, there was a Palestinian uprising in Jordan, and it looked for a while as if Syria might intervene to prevent the Palestinians from being massacred. The United States didn't like that. At the time, the United States was so bogged down in Southeast Asia that it couldn't possibly do anything. So it called on Israel. Israel mobilized, has a very powerful military force. Syria backed down. And that was considered another gift to Saudi Arabia. They were concerned that Saudi Arabia might be threatened by a nationalist uprising in Jordan. A lot of conflict between the two. And at that time, the Nixon Doctrine was established. This was called. The Nixon Doctrine was that, of course, the main concern in the Middle East is the energy reserves. That goes way back to the Second World War, even before. The main concern is the energy reserves, mostly in Saudi Arabia, safely under the control of Islamic religious extremists who do what we like, and we got to keep it that way. But then somebody has to protect the dictators who we support from their own populations. And so there have to be what the Nixon administration called cops on the beat, local gendarmes, preferably non-Arab, because they do a better job killing Arabs. And then police headquarters, of course, is in Washington, a branch office in London. So that's the basic structure. And at the time, the cops on the beat were Iran, non-Arab, under the Shah, who was a loyal ally and a dictator, Pakistan, which provided the Saudi Royal Guard and so on, still do, a lot of Pakistani mercenaries working in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, non-Arab, big military force, and now Israel was added to it. So Israel's another cop on the beat, and a very useful one. And it sort of continues like this. I go through the record if you like, but there continue to be very close military and intelligence relations. The United States uses Israel to pre-position weapons. Israel can, in fact, carry out experiments with advanced weapons on live targets, which is useful. You try out your new weapons that way. And all sorts of, and also Israel, by the 1980s, it was becoming, Congress was imposing constraints on support for our most vicious clients. So you needed surrogates who would move in and do it. Taiwan, Israel, British intelligence, contractors and others. But Israel played a big role in that kind of secondary services. So that's one category. Another category is strict economic. U.S. investment in Israel high-tech industry is increasing pretty quickly. And it's a close relationship. Israel has a highly militarized high-tech economy. In fact, if you look at one of the interesting WikiLeaks exposures, listed vital regions of the world which are of high strategic importance to the United States must be protected at all odds. There weren't a lot of them. One of them was right near Haifa, Rafael Military Industries, and one of the places where they developed drones and other high-tech weapons. And that's considered just part of the United States. In fact, Rafael, it's a big military industry, actually moved their management to Washington because they're closer to the Pentagon and the funders and so on. A very close integration. Intel, which is the biggest chip company in the world, they have a new generation of chips coming along, which they think will sweep the market. They're building their main factory in Israel. And a lot of other connections like that. And that's a natural. On the other hand, again, the Palestinians offer absolutely nothing. There are other factors which I think are probably underestimated, cultural factors. There's a structure in the world that political scientists sometimes call the Anglosphere, England and its offshoots. Offshoots are the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The Anglosphere is somewhat unusual in the history of imperialism. In the Anglosphere, the English settlers exterminated the native population and replaced them. That's not the usual course of imperialism. And that's deeply embedded in the culture of the Anglosphere. We did it, so it's got to be right. And the Jews are doing it, so it's got to be right. And if you look at international diplomacy, about the only big countries that sometimes go along with the United States, the Marshall Islands do and so on, but real countries, are Australia and increasingly Canada. They, I think, just sense a kind of commonality. And this is reinforced by something else. The Anglosphere is unusually religious. Deeply religious. These are fundamentalist societies, particularly the United States. The United States is one of the most extreme fundamentalist societies in the world. About a third of the population believes in the literal truth of the Bible. I doubt that there's another country in the world that comes close to that. And about half the population thinks the world was created a couple thousand years ago, because that's what it says in their interpretation of the Bible. About 2/3 of the population is expecting the second coming. Some of them, like Rick Perry, expected in our lifetime. These are extremely unusual things. Well, and in fact, it's not, we think about it sometimes as, uneducated people in rural Texas. It's not. It's the elites. Lord Balfour, Christian Zionism in England long preceded Jewish Zionism, and it was the elites. Lord Balfour, Lloyd George, these guys. In the United States, When General Allenby conquered Jerusalem during the First World War, you take a look at the headlines in the national press. Richard the Lionhearted defeated Saladin. We won the Crusades. Literally. He saved Jerusalem from the pagans. Well, the Bible says something else. The next thing that has to happen is Jews have to go back to Israel. Even in the Roosevelt administration, Harold Ickes, a major person, said that the return of the Jews to Palestine is the most important event in human history. And if you're a Bible-reading fanatic, yeah, you could believe that. And this permeates large parts of American culture, from elites down to evangelicals. When you get to people like, say, Bush #2, evangelical extremists and others, well, it takes on a different form. But that's real, and that, I think, reinforces the general sense that there's got to be something right about the Jews kicking out the Palestinians, because it's pretty much what we did. And in fact, if you look back over the history, the analogy of Jews in Palestine to the United States and Red Indians runs all the way through. You find it all over the place. I don't know how much weight to put on these factors, but I think they're significant cultural factors, along with very clear strategic, intelligence, military, and economic factors. It could be changed. I mean, if significant parts of the real US power system decided to shift, it would shift. And incidentally, there are signs of that, interesting signs of that. If you read closely stuff that's coming out from military leaders, high intelligence officials, even the centers of strategic planning, like the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Strategy, one of these conservative think tanks concerned with military, they're beginning to raise questions about whether the strategic analysis, the strategic alliance with Israel really makes sense at this point. I'm sure you saw a statement by General Petraeus, the head of the strategic command, Central Command for the region. He, a couple of years ago, said that Israel's intransigence is harming our brave boys and girls, fighting out in the fields. He was immediately shut up, but he was expressing a view that is expressed by others. If that ever broke through, I think you would see a wave of anti-Semitism in the United States that would be fierce. These Jews are harming our brave boys and girls, and they're not going to accept that. And it might shift American policy radically. It wouldn't be very pretty, and I don't want to see it change that way, but it could happen. Other things could happen too, but if you just consider the balance of force and power and wealth between Israel and the Palestinians, what's happening kind of almost follows like a theorem.
Over here.
Thank you.
Hello. Is this fine? Okay. How has the language surrounding unpeoples evolved since the genesis of the State of Israel to contemporary times? And how can the Palestinians distinguish themselves as peoples?
How did the language of unpeople evolve since the establishment of Israel, and how can it be changed?
Well, the actual term is more recent. It's, as far as I know, not before Mark Curtis, who used it a couple of years ago in his books on British imperial crimes. But the concept is there, and it goes way back. That's the way we treat the native population here. They're unpeople. You kill them, exterminate them, break treaties, steal their land. The African-American population is kind of obvious. In fact, the Constitution says they're 3/5 human, they're unpeople. As I mentioned, the 14th Amendment was supposed to remedy that in the Civil War, but it really didn't. just for a couple of years, and it went right back to the same thing with criminalization and so on. And we're right in the middle of it now. It's just a standard imperial concept. Actually, it's a pretty interesting history. If you look at the, I don't know if we should go into this, but if you look at the intellectual history, it's kind of interesting. In the 17th century, in England and France, main imperial powers, there was a lot of concern. They were discovering lots of new creatures, you know, expanding beyond Europe, and you get these blacks, orangutans, a lot of others, and there's a lot of discussion about which ones are people and should have rights and which ones aren't people. And especially if you were a Cartesian, that was pretty crucial, because for a Cartesian, there's a sharp distinction between creatures who have a soul and those who don't. The ones who have a soul are people. The ones who don't are not people. They're machines, in fact. A long story behind that. So a lot of debates. And they were kind of, you know, trying to figure out who's, I mean, they kind of look the same. They're not Europeans, so how do we decide? There's some very interesting discussions. A lot of it had to do with, one of my favorite arguments was by Louis Racine, the son of the dramatist. He concluded that apes are actually smarter than us. And the proof is they don't use language. And the reason behind it is that they understand that if they used language, we would enslave them, like we enslave the blacks. Maybe. You could add that to the literature on teaching apes language. They're smart enough not to do it, you know. But it was a serious issue, right through the early days of imperialism, and then it kind of goes on, you know.
Over here.
Professor Chomsky, what are your thoughts about the recent diplomatic tension between Israel and Turkey about the Mavi Marmara event and the UN report, and Turkey's role in the region regarding the peace process?
What are your views about the relation between Turkey and Israel and the recent events?
Well, Turkey and Israel have been very close allies since 1958. It was kind of secret at the time, you know, known but not discussed. But in 1958, Ben Gurion made, you know, agreements with Turkey, and they've been very close allies since. This continued right through the Nixon doctrine period. Military relations, economic relations, they couldn't have much in the way of public diplomatic relations because, you know, have to look. It didn't fit with the image, but they continued. In fact, it was Israel's only regional ally, and an important one. Well, last couple of years, that's in fact declined. Prime Minister Erdogan has taken pretty strong stands against Israeli crimes. During the Gaza attack, he was about the only Western, sort of quasi-Western, if you like, leader who actually came out very strongly denouncing the crimes. The West mostly accepted them. Then came the Mavi Marmara incident where Israel attacked a ship in international waters. It's called hijacking when Somalis do it. And it happened to be a Turkish ship. Primarily, no, not technically, it was essentially a Turkish ship. They attacked the ship in international waters and killed 9 Turks, one of them American citizen. And Turkey didn't like that. And that made relations much worse. Israel was quite surprised by this reaction, and with good reason. I mean, Israel had been hijacking ships in international waters for decades. I mean, it goes back to the 70s. You know, the ships going between Cyprus and Lebanon, Israel would attack them, you know, kill people, kidnap people, bring them to prisons in Israel. And nobody ever made a fuss about it because the U.S. was saying, you know, fine. And they didn't quite understand why all of a sudden it's an issue. But it did become an issue, and it's now gone beyond. I mean, practically, Israel has reacted in a, Israel's gone way to the right, you have to understand. I mean, it was 10 years ago, I think they would have smoothed it over. But Israel went way out of its way to make the relations worse. So the foreign minister in Israel, foreign minister, Dani Ayalon, sub-foreign, what is he? He was foreign minister, yeah. He called in he was a deputy foreign minister, I think, yeah. He called in the Turkish ambassador and set up a kind of a televised scene in which he was sitting on a high chair and the Turkish ambassador sitting on a low stool, and it was all televised, and he's kind of lecturing him. You know, that's just not done in diplomatic relations. And Turkey didn't like it a bit, you know. There are things going on like that. And it's gotten pretty tense by now. I mean, Turkey has stated that I don't know if they'll do it, that they'll send naval vessels to accompany ships trying to break the Gaza siege, like the flotilla. If that happened, I don't know what would happen. We'd go to war. Just recently, there was an announcement, I don't know if it's true, that Israeli planes were scrambling in Turkish airspace to harass Turkish vessels that are exploring for natural gas. That's a big conflict brewing all through the region. You know, there's been a lot of natural gas discoveries in that whole region, and everybody wants a piece of them, and a lot of conflicts. And one of them is Turkey and Israel. Turkey complained about it. I don't know if it's true. It was just reported on, you know, in the press. But if that kind of thing goes on, there could be serious conflicts.
Thank you.
Over here.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. Just want to thank you for doing what you do. And considering the global protesting going on, especially this past Saturday, and even in New York City, do you think a people's movement can start in Israel to challenge these policies? And if so, how would the US react to that? Thank you.
Can a people's movement start in Israel to challenge these problems?
Well, I mean, there has been a pretty interesting kind of Occupy movement in Israel. It's relative to population, it's probably the biggest one in the world. It's kind of, I mean, they have pretty narrow goals. Understandable, but narrow. You know, it's pretty, you know, reasonably privileged people. You know, people like you, basically, students. You know, relatively well-off families who are being squeezed hard by the neoliberal policies. So they can't get apartments. They got to live in their parents' homes. You know, can't get decent jobs, and the same thing's happening all over the West. And they protested about that. It excluded, by decision, anything related to the occupation. So it didn't mention that. Like, the reasoning apparently was if they brought it up, it would just undermine it. Israeli Arabs apparently didn't participate. They're the most repressed group in Israel, along with Orthodox Jews, who also live in poverty. I don't think they participated. So it was kind of you know, relatively affluent, educated uprising, and a pretty serious one, but for narrow goals. Could anything go beyond that? It's pretty hard to say. Israel's changed a lot in the last few years, dramatically. It's shifted way to the right. This shows up in diplomacy and a lot of other things. So, for example, take the demand that, Netanyahu's demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. As far as I know, that's just arisen in the last couple of years. It was never raised before. And it's just a kind of a barrier to ensure that negotiations won't get anywhere. I mean, it's kind of like the notion right to exist, which as far as I know arose in the 70s after steps were being taken to accept the right to exist in peace and security, you know, the wording of UN 242. Got to raise the barrier to prevent, I mean, no country has a right to, no state has a right to exist. Like Mexico recognizes the United States, but it doesn't recognize its right to exist on half of Mexico, conquered by aggression. You know, as far as a Jewish state is concerned, you know, Obama recognizes it, but no sane politician, say, recognizes Pakistan as an Islamic state. That's what they call themselves. So we recognize Pakistan, but we don't recognize Pakistan as an Islamic state. You know, we just recognize Pakistan. Same with, you know, Saudi Arabia, which is extreme. But so this is a new demand, and it's a reflection of the general shift to the right, which is very noticeable. So whether anything can, I mean, in Israel, amazingly, they do not, you know, overwhelmingly, I don't know the figures, but it's very high, do not understand why the world was outraged by the Gaza attack. They don't understand why the world was outraged by the Mavi Marmara. In fact, the standard picture in Israel, you know, aside from the fringes, is Arab brave soldiers were attacked by the people on the ship. I mean, that's their conception, overwhelmingly. They're kind of circling the wagons. It has a certain resemblance to South Africa. There's some interesting comparisons. There's a lot of comparisons drawn with South Africa. Most of them don't make any sense. But there's some that are very, I think, meaningful. I'll mention one. Around 1960, the apartheid regime understood that they're beginning to be recognized as an international pariah. And in fact, in, I think 1960 or so, the foreign minister called in the American ambassador and told him, we have the documents have been declassified, that we understand we're a pariah state, everyone votes against us in the United Nations, but you and I know that there's only one vote in the United Nations, yours, and as long as you support us, we don't give a damn what the rest of the world thinks. And that's exactly the way it developed. By the 1970s, the UN imposed an embargo. And by the 1980s, the US Congress imposed sanctions. The Reagan administration continued to support South Africa as part of their global war on terror. In fact, in 1988, the Reagan administration declared that the African National Congress, Mandela's Congress, was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. So you had to defend the white regime against them. And that was not a small thing. That led to millions of deaths, literally. And that continued until about 1988. Meanwhile, South Africa was acting more and more what looks like irrationally. I mean, they were carrying out major atrocities, just kind of kicking the world in the face, you know, attacking refugee camps for no reason, killing hundreds of people. And they have, the white regime thought as long as they got the United States behind them, it just doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks, which turned out to be right. Around 1990, for reasons that we can only surmise, there's no documentary record, the United States changed its position suddenly. And that was the end of apartheid. Within a couple of years, it was formally gone. I think you can guess the reasons, but we don't really have documentary evidence. And I think Israel's following the same course and treading on pretty thin ice.
It's my job to, is this on? It's my job to make sure Professor Chomsky gets to his flight on time, and in order to do that, we have to leave right at 7:45. So I'm very sorry to the people who wanted to ask questions but couldn't, but we need to stop here and thank Professor Chomsky.